Hi everyone, I'm Josh, and I'm going to talk to you about an application of BayesACT to the Iterated Networked Prisoner's Dilemma game, which is just a variant on the classical Prisoner's Dilemma, which is one of those simple canonical games that shows up all the time in the literature, but it's interesting because of its possibility for applications to important real life situations, for example. So anytime you can think of a situation where two parties would benefit from cooperating, but one could benefit just a little more by screwing the other guy. So, for example, things like on a national level, we have things like nuclear disarmament, right, or curbing carbon emissions. On a personal level, you might have who's going to take out the garbage, or of course, as is the actual explanation for the game, whether or not you're going to rat out your partner in crime, which could be very important for me if this whole academic thing doesn't work out. So, as Professor Hoey mentioned, this game is defined by a 2x2 reward matrix in which either player can either cooperate or defect. And these rewards must conform to the inequality at the bottom, for the prisoner's dilemma, which sets out that defection is a dominant strategy, which means that if you defect, independent of what the other guy did, you will do better than if you had cooperated. Therefore, a rational agent will only ever choose to defect in the single-shot prisoner's dilemma game. However, we know from numerous studies and several television game shows that humans are not rational about this. They will cooperate, and so a fully rational agent cannot predict human behavior. This is where BayesACT comes in. And BayesACT was first applied to the iterated prisoner's dilemma, that is, the prisoner's dilemma played several rounds between the same two people. It was first studied in a paper by Asghar and Hoey, which is in Professor McKinnon's slides and also the references at the end of this. Here we take things a step farther and apply it to the iterated networked prisoner's dilemma game, which brings us kind of one step closer to large-scale social interactions. In particular, we model the game as a graph, where the nodes are the players and the edges between them define who's going to be playing who. So one player plays many games at the same time. We're concerned with what's called the broadcast version of this game, where the player chooses either cooperate or defect, and then that choice gets broadcast out across all the edges to all of its neighbors. You get, on any turn, one choice for everyone. So to make this concrete, let's look at an example. Suppose we're interested in the middle node who is cooperating, who's green and happy. We've got two green cooperators and two red defectors for neighbors. So according to the reward matrix, his score will be 2 for each cooperator, plus 0 for each defector, or 4 points. If instead we had defected, then it would get 3 points for each cooperator and 1 for each defector, for a total of 8 points. So why this particular version of the game? As it turns out, numerous human studies have been done, and several of these were compared in a paper by Jelena Grujic and others. They identified several key parts of human play, and so what we hope to see is that BayesACT can reproduce these in this setting. We'll look at them one at a time here. First off is network invariance. What this means is that independent of the structure of the graph, things like edge density, the number of edges per player, we should see no difference, no statistically significant difference in the percent of cooperative acts. We're interested in particular with Erdos-Renyi graphs, which are randomly constructed, and grid graphs, which are more what they did for the human participants than being easier to set up. Both can be varied in terms of density, although for the grids, more or less limited to 4 or 8 neighbors. Next, we have a declining cooperation over time, and it follows a very particular pattern. It will start off fairly optimistic, fairly high cooperation rates. Their hopes are quickly dashed. And then we see relatively constant, stable period of play after that. Next, we expect to see an anti-correlation of earnings and cooperation, which is perhaps why their hopes were dashed. Essentially, the more you cooperate, the worse you're expected to do. And finally, we want to see something called moody conditional cooperation, which comes in 2 parts. The first is a hysteresis or moodiness, which says that whatever you did on your last turn, you're more likely to keep doing. And second part is conditionality, which is contingent on what your neighbors do. If they cooperate, you're more likely to cooperate, and if they defect, you're more likely to defect. These are some fairly simple criteria that we would hope to see in BayesACT agents. So let's look at the bots that will be playing this game. The first is BayesACT, and it uses the Monte Carlo tree search method that Professor Hoey mentioned earlier. You can read the details in Asgar and Hoey. I don't really have time to go into them here. But there are a couple of assumptions that need to be made because this bot was designed for playing against one other opponent. The first is that when you're playing against many opponents, you need to keep some distribution for their identity. And in this case, what we've done is kept a distribution for a sort of amalgamated general opponent, one entity. You may or may not think that that's valid, but it seems reasonable based on the fact that a person playing this game is unlikely to think of each other node as being an individual person. So this still leaves the issue of what to do with all of these incoming actions, and there is the option to do them one at a time, like cooperate, cooperate, defect, cooperate, and so on. But this makes the order matter, and there's not a clear way in order to how to parse that. So instead, again, we take the average, and it becomes one sort of amalgamated action, and this gets fed into BayesACT. Now, we tested several versions of the BayesACT bots, varying the POMCP timeout, which is the amount of time that it gets to think, essentially. So shorter times result in more short-sighted bots that only consider the immediate future, whereas longer timeouts give you what amounts to a more scheming bot. It thinks more in the long term, in principle, and also two different EPA distributions for how it thinks about itself, its opponents, and the actions. These are kind of important. So the first uses the default, what I'm calling the default BayesACT settings, essentially the ones that were in use before it came to the lab. The default settings are specifically chosen to create adversarial relationships. Some portion of the agents have identities centered on the friend EPA, others on the Scrooge EPA. And the two actions likewise are set to be far apart. They're the EPAs for collaborate with and abandon. Whereas the BayesACT S refers to a study that was performed last year where we actually had undergrads come to the lab, come to a computer lab and play the game on computers and do EPA ratings all the while. We deliberately kept all the language, like we never used the word opponent, it was always other player or partner. We kept everything as neutral as possible, and so these EPA ratings are much more neutral, much closer to zero. And we'll see how that affects things. So the bot that we're comparing against is an imitation-based bot. This was proposed by Danielle Malone and others for this particular game as a means of reproducing human behavior. In particular, moody conditional cooperation is what they're after. The way that the bot works is that with some probability, you just imitate one of your neighbors at random. And the rest of the time, you strategically choose the neighbor that did the best on the previous round. Here we try several versions where we vary Q all the way from 0, so that would be pure strategic choice, up to 100, which is purely random. We also varied some variables within the environment, several different network types which vary the structure and the density, and several reward matrices which were designed to punish defection to a greater or lesser degree. In M1, defection is pretty good, 50% better than if you have 11. Here we have 10, but the benefit is small. Right? You get 1 point if you defect successfully. So we took all of the combinations of the bots and all the combinations of the game variables and ran them each 20 times for 60 iterations of the game each. These ran, so there's about 33,000 simulations, and they monopolized the local computing cluster for a couple weeks. So let's have a look at the results then. So first up is the network invariance condition. There's a lot of numbers, I know. What we did here was we looked at the cooperation rate by round for each of the bots across all three of these networks and then did a G-test to see if the results were statistically distinguishable. But remember, we're looking for network invariance, which means that we don't want to see them be distinguishable. Therefore, instead of looking for a low p-value, like is the norm, we actually want to see a high p-value, indicating that we couldn't tell the difference. And this is overwhelmingly what we see for the BayesACT bots, not so much for the imitators. This is just one example. In aggregate, we get results like this. So each of the BayesACT versions, we see upwards of 90% the indistinguishability. The imitator bots less than 6. And you can make the argument that it's only the best setting for each of the bots that matters. And if we do that, all of the results go up, of course, but the imitator bots still far behind. Next, we looked at the declining cooperation rate. And here we don't see great success from either of our agent types. This, for reference, is what one of the human experiments looked like. Here are two of the BayesACT simulations superposed on top. So as you can see, they stay fairly level over time. And although some of them look pretty close to the humans, like others are not. And we don't see this initial drop that we had hoped to see. So we're not gonna call that a success. On the other hand, imitator bots, they're a special kind of bad in this regard. The vast majority do this. They go to full defection very, very quickly. So you do see that precipitous drop just then to 0, so not great. And some of the rest of them, they actually go up in cooperation, balloons near full cooperation. It's also bad. So next, looking at the score versus cooperation, we did a Pearson correlation test, and you see that what we're looking for in the Pearson test is that it has a negative correlation and with a p-value of less than 0.5. So it's a statistically significant negative correlation. We find that this is the case for all of the default settings for BayesACT, for less, but still most of the study-based agents, and for relatively few of the imitator agents, notably with a 0% for this last matrix. This one, remember, is the one that punished defection the most, or gave you the least benefit for defecting, so it's the hardest case. And finally, we look at the two parts of Moody conditional cooperation. So spoiler, the imitators are going to do well here. This is what they were built for. BayesACT struggles a little bit. For the hysteresis portion, this is where you are more likely to do the same thing as the last term. Default agents do really well. Sunny agents do really poorly, interestingly. Looking at conditionality, we see that neither is great. If we look at the best, the 44 and 67%, not great, not total write-offs, but somewhere in the middle. So looking at the overall scorecard, then we find that our BayesACT D agents, they have like 2.5, 3 if you're generous. Successes, BayesACT S, like I think that's 3.5. 2.5, 3. Here we have 2 to 2.5, and for the imitators, just the one thing that they do well. So what can we say about these results? Well, one thing is the difference between the BayesACT D and the BayesACT S agents. This is what I was expecting was that the BayesACT S agents, having presumably the more appropriate EPA values, would display these things better. But I think the neutrality of the study came into effect. In this experiment, what you really want to see is a large difference between the two options. If they're close together in the EPA space, then it's easy to not really see the difference between them. And of course, the imitator bots fail at everything except the one they were specifically supposed to do. Looking forward, there's some interesting things you could do. I'll skip most of these, but one thing that's particularly interesting is the idea of not using the broadcast model. I remember David Heiss's jury paper in which he set out a specific ordering for how people might act. And although computationally that would be a bit difficult to apply to 100+ agents in a network, it's an interesting direction that you could take to see group dynamics. All right, that's all my presentation, and thanks for listening.